I've been looking forward to this conversation today. We have Charlie Cobb and we have Austin Thompson, and I'm not going to take time to introduce them because I'd like for each of them to introduce themselves. And so I'm going to start with Charlie, and Charlie, ask you to just give us a brief introduction and to get us started on this conversation, which really focuses on organizing for change.
Okay. I'll see if I can do that in a couple of minutes. This is Charlie Cobb, and I think I know everybody on this screen, whose names I'm seeing. Always happy to talk to y'all. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, as you know. I'm a SNCC veteran, as you know. I am also a writer, an author. At work now on my fourth book. And largely, with one exception, I write about the Southern freedom movement. I did one book, American Activists and African Liberation. With I'm always pushing the organizing idea in these kinds of conversations, and more am pushing the idea of what the relevance of our experience as SNCC organizers in the 1960s is to organizing today. There are some differences, obviously, but I think the core idea of organizing at the grassroots, which defined our work, is as relevant in the 21st century as it was in the mid 20th century, and particularly in my conversations with today's young activists. I'm always trying to push forward what I think are the links between organizing yesterday and organizing today, and since I live in the state of Florida, moving with increasing speed toward authoritarianism and really the idea of a police state. I find much of the experience in the Mississippi of White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan relevant to the 21st century. I know that's a broad area of conversations, and I won't elaborate any further. And I also will end on that note.
Thanks. And Austin, your world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. And good to see you again, Charlie. I will just start by saying that my name is Austin Thompson. I live in Seattle, Washington on the West Coast, but my roots are deep in the South of the United States, the Black Belt South. And my people are Black working people, particularly in the South. My grandparents fled from the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration of the mid 20th century. And I don't use the word or the verb fled lightly. Through force of land theft, racial discrimination, totalitarianism. They ended up in the industrialized Midwest, and they got jobs in the post-World War II economic boom in the Midwest that was driven primarily by technological changes, known in that era as the Fordish change in production. And then after World War II, and starting in World War II and then after World War II in the industrial Midwest, many people like my grandparents left from the totalitarianism and fascism of the Jim Crow South and found industry jobs there. 2 generations later, my parents fled from the deindustrializing Midwest due to further changes in the way that production is organized in the country, and poverty and crime that resulted in that deindustrialization. And they went back to the South. So I am a product of a reverse migration, which is a deep longing for economic mobility and for democracy amongst Black working people. and their stories and contributions in my direct family, but going back generations, I think since the time that people from the African continent were enslaved and brought to this landmass that we call North America. Those struggles of working people that W.E.B. Du Bois named in his key text, Black Reconstruction, of Black working people who, through their courage, their heroism, their discipline across generations, have helped make what we know as the best of American democracy possible. And to Mr. Charlie Cobb's concerns about authoritarianism, rising authoritarianism, we know that the past is prologue, and it will be the heroic struggles once again of Black working people. And I think in the southern part of the United States, that'll be key to not just defending what we know and have come to know as democracy, but to deepen democracy, to deepen the way that we conceive of it, so that it's continues to be about the expression of political voice, but it's also about democracy in our economy, so that everyday, ordinary working people, no matter what their race, ethnicity, or their ranking on the economic hierarchy of the nation, have a voice and say over their economic lives as well. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm really a product of my people's history, and I say people both referring to African American working people, but broadly, the people of this country, of this amalgam of folks from all around the world who have had a collision course in this particular epoch with one another. And I can talk more about how I got interested in organizing, but I will say that Charlie said something key here, which I think somebody who's listening might overlook. The legacy of SNCC is not just about a particular time period. The legacy of SNCC, to me, is about an organizing tradition. The best of American in this landmass organizing tradition. And the SNCC legacy, that foundation, this organizing tradition, many of the most successful organizing movements that people point to as examples of the power of people coming together and the strength of power in numbers, they are drawing from that organizing tradition. But because of the way that SNCC at the time did its deep organizing work, they didn't always play in the narrative terrain, so that when you think about organizing and mobilization, people are not referring back to the source of that, or a lot of where that comes from. And so there's a deep intelligence in the SNCC legacy and in the organizing tradition of SNCC. And I've committed some of my life is really about the future, but a lot of it nowadays is about recovering the true history and past of organizing, because we know that a tree with deep roots is able to grow. And I think the monumental challenges that we face right now as a nation are going to require us to be deeply rooted in that organizing tradition. And so I hope we'll have an opportunity to get into that more, the tradition that Mr. Charlie Cobb was alluding to, but then also his points about the current challenges in front of us and how we can carry that tradition forward.
Well, let's dive right into that. I mean, I think that that's really important, and that it's when I'm a proud member of the SNCC Legacy Project, and that one of our greatest accomplishments in the last few years, because we're still very active, has been the creating websites, and where we have then placed a lot of primary source materials and interviews and other documents about organizing and about SNCC's work in organizing. But I think it would be, and because of the websites, we get a lot of questions, particularly from young students and from people all over the world asking about organizing. And so I think it would be really useful if you, Austin, and Charlie would talk about what is organizing, what's the essence of organizing, and then how you each came to organizing. I'll start with you, Charlie, and then throw it to Austin.
Well, to talk about me and to talk about SNCC's organizing tradition, I think we have to start with Ella Baker, because she's the one who plugged us into that tradition. I think without Miss Baker, I'm not sure to what extent we would have really become an organization of organizers, as distinct from an organization of protesters, which is not to disparage protest. It's just to note that there was a shift in SNCC in which it increasingly became an organization of organizers. And I talk to young people, young activists a lot about this tradition. And I like to make the point with them that if you look across the whole span of Black history, Africans who were enslaved were not marching in protest on the auction blocks. And Africans who were enslaved were not having sit-ins at the Plantation Manor dining room table seeking a seat. What were they doing? Well, they were organizing something: escape, revolt, sabotage, even assassination. There's a whole history which we don't have time to go into in detail. But there's a whole tradition related to Black resistance that belongs, into which this organizing tradition belongs. And it's where you really find the strength in the Black community. And Miss Baker recognized this before we were even born, and passed that on to us. And we quickly learned that as we began to try and sink roots in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and all of these places. And what we learned how to do, of course, was talk to people and listen to people. And what we discovered was two things. One, there was strength that we hadn't recognized in Black communities that could advance Black freedom. And secondly, we learned that it was possible to gain a foothold in communities that enabled us to work in these communities and find people that we didn't even know were there. The key thing here is we managed to figure out how to get footholds in places like Southwest Georgia, Central Alabama, the Mississippi Delta, or Southwest Mississippi, the Arkansas Delta, and retain enough balance, if you will, to work toward change. And I think that was an important discovery for us, and it belongs to the organizing tradition. And although I can't speak from firsthand experience on the generations that preceded me, I imagine that much the same thing was true, say, of the folks that were engaged in the Stono River Rebellion, or folks that were engaged in all Nat Turner's rebellion, or Denmark Beatty's rebellion. Imagine that much the same, their discoveries were much along the same lines. All I can say is that, certainly for me personally, in the Mississippi Delta, that was my discovery, that it was possible to gain a foothold in places like Ruleville, or Issaquena County, or LaFlora County, and do work and make my way and make our way, meaning SNCC collectively, to people whom we hadn't realized in the beginning were actually there. That's the story of Mrs. Hamer and us. You know, that's the story of Mama Dolly Raines in Southwest Georgia and us, or R.L. Strickland in Alabama and us. That's the story. We found footholds in these places and then found these people who basically told us, it's taking you long enough. We've been waiting for you for a while. What's taking you so long? And we're prepared to really risking more than we had at risk, risk their lives, their livelihoods, their homes, and various other institutions in their community. They put all of that at risk, and we were able to make our way to these people. That's the organizing tradition. That's there. And you do that by learning how to listen to people. And you do that by learning how to talk to people. And it was harder for me to learn how to talk to people than it was, say, for Hollis Watkins, a native Mississippian, or any number of people I could tick off. But we learned how to do that. And it was that drove the organizing, I think. And I think young activists today have to figure out how to do that in their communities. And I suspect, in fact, I know, and I'll end on this, that it's much more difficult today on the west side of Chicago or South Central LA or someplace than it was for us in the Mississippi Delta or Southwest Mississippi, for all the violence that unfolded in the South is, I think, harder for them today to figure out how to get the kind of footholds that we had that enabled us to organize. I'll sort of end on that note. I shut myself down because I don't want to take up the whole hour or two.
But you've raised some important points, and I'm really curious, and my mind is a whirl with the thoughts of how, in today's world, does social media, which is so prevalent in our world, does it help in making those connections and finding community, or is it a hindrance? So,
Let
us,
me answer that very quickly, because I think we'll have to get to this later on too. It's both a help and a hindrance. I tell, again, young activists today, we had the mimeograph machine and the fax line, and sometimes I wish we did have all the kinds of social media that you all have to mobilize people and push people into action. By any definition, it's easier in the sense of communicating at that level, mobilization, with the kind of social media we have at our disposal today. On the other hand, and the negative side of this is that it tends to reduce human contact and interaction, I think. If you can tweet somebody or Facebook somebody or whatever people do today, and I'm largely ignorant in this arena, but whatever it is that people do, if you can do that, it's not really the same thing as sitting on somebody's front porch or going to church with them or eating dinner or lunch with them or drinking beer at the juke joint, and all the conversations that flow out of that kind of human face-to-face interaction. I think there's less of that today, and I got lots of examples of that, about how puzzled sometimes young activists seem when I bring up this question of face-to-face interaction for the purpose of organizing. They're real good at mobilizing for protest. They're real good at any number of things that I'm envious of, thinking back to my days in the middle and early 1960s. But it puts at risk, in some respects, the kind of personal interaction you also need if you're going to organize effectively. And that's one of the answers to, they have to figure out how to answer this, because they're not going to, nobody's going to end in Twitter or any of these other things that people use, Instagram, TikTok, or whatever. But they're going to have to figure this out in the sense of organizing, I think. But I'm open to other comments. It's a question that interests me greatly. And again, I'm proud for my hand and with this collective body and the SNCC Legacy Project's websites. I guess I have to use the plural now. And I'm pleased with that. But it doesn't, it informs, but it's not the answer to, in my view, to the organizing question that's going to confront the millennials and whatever you call the group that's younger than them in the 21st century.
Austin?
I think so much of what Charlie said resonates with me as well, my own trajectory. So I got involved with organizing, not for the love of organizing, but for the love of organizing to build power. I grew up, I mentioned that my parents had moved back to Georgia, and they moved there at a moment of tension about the potential for a new South. And we saw a backlash in my community where I grew up, which I now call the Neo-Confederacy, where the last Democratic governor of Georgia, and I'll say the last because we haven't had a Democratic governor in Georgia since, he decided to remove the Confederate flag from the state flag. I'll try to get emotional about it, but I was bullied. I didn't even know anything about that history, and people were teasing me, what do you think about the flag? And it got to the point where in my 20s, my parents apologized to me for how I was treated in elementary and middle school. And so I know what powerlessness feels like. And I learned early on that it's not what's right, unfortunately, it's who's right in this society, and that might equals right in this society. And I learned that our heroes were not their heroes, and I remember in Dayton, Ohio, before we moved to Georgia, when Nelson Mandela got free from prison, I was in kindergarten or first grade, and they had coloring books and we sang songs. We didn't do any work that day. And then I later learned that Mandela was not their hero. They considered Mandela a terrorist. And then I learned Martin Luther King, even though we had a Martin Luther King Day, that the same people who were harassing me about the Confederate flag and the same folks who were struggling to defend it had labeled Martin Luther King as a communist and a terrorist, and they were no fan of him. Harriet Tubman, a hero of mine, was not a hero of theirs. W.B. Du Bois, I mentioned earlier, was an outcast of theirs. Their heroes were people like Rambo and Jefferson Davis from the Confederacy, or Newt Gingrich, who came to my elementary school, and I actually shook Newt Gingrich's hand. That's the district I grew up in. And I learned quickly that their priorities were not our priorities around equity and belonging and moving beyond poverty in a nation with so much plenty. And so their heroes were not our heroes. Their priorities are not our priorities. Their values were not our values, but they were imposed on us because we didn't have power. They controlled the school board. They controlled what was taught in the textbooks. They controlled the governor and the state legislator. They controlled the senators. So they made their priorities our priorities. And I understood at a young age that in quotations, as they say, to the victor goes the spoils. And because of that, I, at 16 years old, began to learn about the organizing tradition that Charlie Cobb and SNCC were a part of. And he pointed to Miss Ella Baker, who, again, is one of the most important progenitors of this organizing tradition. And we know from, I have learned from reading the biography by Barbara Ransby about Miss Ella Baker, that she learned a lot during the Great Depression era in the 1930s of organizing. And you can see another era of this lineage of organizing, the Scottsboro Boys case, the anti-lynching campaigns that were taking place at that time, sharecropper organizing in the 1930s. And then there's another period of the late 1800s with the Colored People's Farmers Alliance, which not many people are aware of. A sharecropper-led organization of 1.2 million Negroes, as they called them then, who were organizing in the cotton fields of the Black Belt South in the height of the lynching period. So I was learning all of this history in high school, and I made a commitment that because I knew what it felt like to be powerless. I know that the victory goes to the victor goes the spoils. I wanted to understand how to bring that organizing tradition forward. And so to fast forward, I joined the labor movement in the United States as a place where Black working people were able to self-sustain pretty democratic organizing structures, which are in decline and were in decline in the United States at that time. But they were one of the few spaces where I could see the Fannie Lou Hamers of this generation, of my generation, taking an active role in shaping the future as part of an organizational infrastructure. And I learned the tactics of organizing through that work in the labor movement. Tactics like house visits, going door to door, sitting down, having a conversation with a person. You know, Mr. Charlie Cobb talked about listening, that deep listening. You can't do that deep listening just over a phone bank or on the fly. Then there's the tactic of a phone bank. There's canvassing, and there's a difference between canvassing as a tactic and house visits as a tactic, phone banking as a tactic. And what we innovated in the labor movement was combining issue organizing around issues that workers and working people of all races and ethnicities care about with voter engagement. So voter registration as a tactic to engage people, combined with pledge cards, issue pledge cards that say, if you want Medicaid, which is a healthcare program in the United States for low income and disabled people with disabilities, and many governors across the country have refused to expand that to them, even though there's a funding source for it from the federal government. So I'm going to work with you to register to vote, and we're going to talk about expanding Medicaid. And then during the pandemic in COVID-19, this question of social media and digital, Charlie, we learned innovations in a tactic of digital canvassing, that digital canvassing can be a very effective medium, even though it's different from house visits in person or phone banking or canvassing either at the door or site-based canvassing at a place like outside of a grocery store. Digital canvassing can replicate some of what we know about in-person relationships in a tactic we now call relational organizing. So it's not just social media, you're speaking out into the abyss in a tweet. You're targeting, I know Kathy, I know Susie, I know Julia, and I'm gonna recruit them to join a phone bank. And I know that they spend most of their time on Facebook, or I know that Emmanuel is a gamer. He plays video games. He plays Fortnite. I'm gonna canvas and reach out to him in that gaming space and recruit him into a canvas in person, site-based canvas at a local high school for voter registration. So these tactical innovations of organizing, and I want to stress this, that organizing, it requires a level of tactical rigor. I think some people think that the will to organize is enough. I went through a very rigorous organizer and training program so that if I go to a door and that person says, I don't have time to talk to you about Medicaid expansion Austin, or clean drinking water, Austin, or broadband, Austin. I'm busy. I know how to what we call tactically affirm, answer, and redirect. I understand that you're busy and that you're watching your child, but they're talking about cutting the budget by 20% for your kid's education. What do you think about that? Did you know about it? No, I didn't know about that. Come on in. As opposed to, I'm too busy, and the person walks away. So tactical rigor is very important to the organizing tradition of SNCC. And unfortunately, one of the things tactically that we've learned is that due to white paternalism, and unfortunately, I have to say that term because there are people who were trained in the lineage of Saul Alinsky, a name that people can Google and look up, and they will claim that that is the organizing tradition that people should follow. And you see a culture of white paternalism where many organizers will go into Black communities to proceed to tell Black communities what issues are the most important and try and agitate them around those issues. And then they parachute in and they leave. And they leave out this historical context that Mr. Charlie Cobb has laid out to us. They lay out the listening and the relationship building, and what Mr. Bob Moses talked about, that organizing is creating spaces for leadership to emerge. So you don't see in this white paternalist model an organic kind of emerging of Black leadership and respect for Black working class women leaders and other leaders in our movement. And so the tactical innovation in organizing about how do you empower voice and agency? How do you do that in the digital domain? Is it a house visit? Is it phone banking? And then a rigor to look at the data, to reflect, to debrief after we've worked on a campaign, or even hell, a day into the campaign, every day. What are the questions that we're debriefing? These are all part of the organizing tradition. And I'll say that there's a strategic level. So the tactical innovation, and then there's a strategic level. And the question there in organizing that I learned over time very quickly is you have to answer, what are we building for the longer term beyond any one campaign? And to what end are we building it? What are we building for the longer term, and to what end? So when Mr. Charlie Cobb said on the call here today, you have to gain a foothold. Mr. Charlie Cobb explained that they learned in some of these places they could build a foothold. But the question I would say we have to be able to answer, and they had to answer, where do you build a foothold and why? They chose Mississippi for a reason. They built the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization for a reason. And so we have to be intentional as organizers about the tactical innovation and rigor and discipline. And we have to also be rigorous about strategy and strategy development. And those are some of the questions I have for Mr. Charlie here, is just about that process of strategy development, but I don't want to ramble too long. And I think people get a sense of how I enter into the organizing tradition of SNCC, and some of the ways that I'm thinking about it on both the tactical level and on the strategic level.
Before you go on, Jennifer, I feel compelled to say, going back to something you said much earlier in your remarks, that you have no idea of how ancient you make me feel when I hear you say you were in kindergarten when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, because I was a young reporter going to South Africa to cover his release. So gives you some sense of generational space, so to speak.
But that's part of the value of this conversation. And one of the things that I will come to later is to get that difference of perspective that age has given us. And I'm of that generation with Charlie, and that it's one of the things that I think we've with the three of us, my sense is that we've all experienced too, is that we see organizing as essential, as critical. I worked in Lowndes County and spent time there, and that we also, though, to the question that you are posing, I believe, Austin, talk about what's the overall strategy? Where is this heading? And that leads to a connection to a Nelson Mandela and a global, a sense of ourselves in a global context. And I know both of you have had experience in that way. And I'd like to just ask you how you see Black America, or our people in this country, within that global context, and what are your thoughts about organizing and strategies for the future in that respect as well? Charlie?
Um, really, my overall view, I'm not very ideological, one. And my overall view has always been, how do you figure out how to empower people? I mean, it's fairly simple on one hand. I mean, you know, it was easy to see in Mississippi, for instance, where I worked, how disempowered people were. And the work, whether it was voter registration or whether it was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or whether it was the Poor People's Corporation, or whether it was the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, the work was about facilitating people taking control of their own lives, empowering people. How do you do that? What works? What doesn't work? For instance, for example, what doesn't work, one of the things we hadn't recognized in beginning the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union was that labor was increasingly not essential on plantations. They were becoming mechanized. And if you went on strike, as they did in, say, Greenville, it just facilitated the use of tractors and automatic equipment and cotton pickers, cotton picking machines, and so forth. So you learn in trying to figure out how to empower people. That's what we, or certainly I, always kept in front of me. That question: how do you best do that? And by empowering people, it didn't mean me getting a seat on the county board of supervisors. It meant people like Mrs. Hamer and Unita Blackwell and others, Hartman Turnbow and E.W. Steptoe. I could go on and on and on with these names. How do you get them in those communities empowered to take control of their own lives? I still think that's the work today, although it's a much more complicated work today, because we have the illusion of empowerment in many places, and that shoves us off course a lot of times, many times. But that still, then and now, was what I had saw as the necessity, what I constantly had to keep in front of me as the terrain I was standing on shifted. Because the terrain does shift. When you got a Voting Rights Act in 1964, that's different than the 1962 Mississippi that I first came to as a 19-year-old, no less. So I still think that's where the discussion belongs among today's activists. You know, how now in this transformed community, because the Black community is also much more urban now than it was then, despite some migration back to the South. It's still largely much more an urban community than it was back in the day, in the early 1960s or 50s. So those conversations are what organizers have to keep in front of those. And those are the kinds of conversations we as SNCC veterans try and facilitate with our website and in our face-to-face conversations, such as, I guess, Highlander was the last place I saw you, Phil. I mean, Austin. I mean, so even in the face, those are the conversations we try and encourage among today's generation, who are the ones who are going to pick up the reins of organizing, who are going to continue this organizing tradition that we all belong to, whatever time period we also belong to. And I don't claim that it's easy or going to be easy, but it's necessary.
Couldn't agree more, Charlie, with that. It is absolutely necessary, and that always putting people at the center, of the vision, and their agency is so key. One of the big things that I think about that has changed is in the 20th century, after the slow decline of the British Empire, starting in World War I, and then of course in World War II, it accelerated. The United States was the world's preeminent global superpower. And for 400 years, even before World War II, this racial construct of whiteness was kind of at the center of the world economy and the world discussion. So anytime you read W.E.B. Du Bois and he talks about the color line, I think it was Souls of Black Folk, or one of the early texts that he wrote in the early 20th century, it was always on this black-white paradigm, because colonialism, slavery, and so SNCC and many of the others, when they thought about the rest of the world, they were looking towards the colonized countries of the world for inspiration. So the one person, one vote slogan that's on the SNCC Legacy website, I believe, and Mr. Charlie Cobb is here to keep me honest, but I think some of that may have come from places like Ghana, where
it came specifically from Zambia. It was a slogan used in the political struggle in Zambia: one man, one vote.
Okay, well, there you go for all of us who are learning. I'm always learning from SNCC, but I think that connection, to the colonies of Europe and the United States, right? These were not the colonies of India or China or Nigeria. They were the colonies of the United States, which colonized countries, believe it or not. And we still have US territories, which we don't call colonies. And then, of course, Europe. That shaped the way that Black people thought about themselves. We even called ourselves minorities because we were minority in relationship to white people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that world is over. I studied abroad in India in my early 20s with an instinct that the world economy was shifting towards Asia. And right now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa now have a combined total GDP per capita that's larger than the G7 countries of the United States and Europe. So when I have children who will be in, mixed race, Black and Latino kids, I'm not going to look at the achievement gap between them and, no offense, but some, a white kid in Mississippi. I'm going to be thinking about the achievement gap globally in math, science, technology, with Asia, with South Africa, in a global way. And that fundamental psychological shift in how Black people see ourselves and our place in the world should give us high confidence in a way that previous generations maybe did not have, to chart our own path. So in Jackson, Mississippi today, in New York City, we have Black mayors all across the country, Karen Bass in Los Angeles. And we know that each of them have trade relationships around the world directly for economic development. And Brazil, trade relationships there, India, China, South Africa. The world is our oyster. We have sanctions on Russia, so I'm not mentioning Russia, but I think you get my drift, is that our relationship to the international situation as Black people in the United States is qualitatively different because that there has been a qualitative shift. The second thing I would say that we're learning is in these so-called Americas, this region known as the Americas, we are seeing a battle, a contestation for multiracial democracy for the first time in human history. Remember, the term democracy, its origins are Greek, and in Greece, in their so-called democracy, only some people could vote. They had slaves, etc. It was not the notion of a broad-based, inclusive, multiracial, participatory democracy that, thanks to the organizing tradition of SNCC and others, is now center stage. That same longing for multiracial democracy, for people of difference to be seen, to be heard, to have voice, is percolating across the Americas, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Mexico with indigenous people, Black Afro descendants in the countries that I mentioned, this flowering. And at the same time, the forces of opposition to these communities having voice, having a sense of belonging, having a role to play in the democracy, in the economy, those forces of opposition, what Mr. Charlie Cobb talked about as authoritarianism, are also percolating in these Americas. And then one great example of this is in Brazil. We saw the emergence of Donald Trump in the United States, and we saw his parallel in Brazil in Bolsonaro, both who lost their re-election campaigns, and both who lost their re-election campaigns in large part due to the vibrant participation of Black civil society organizations and leaders who, as they have done time and time again, have been a moral compass for their countries, despite having every reason to hold deep resentments. They have decided to not just fight for their own destinies and inclusion, but fight for the destinies and inclusion of all people, even to the benefit of those who might otherwise wish harm to them. And in Brazil and in the United States, I think you can peer into what will be one of the key questions of the next couple of decades. Is multiracial democracy possible? If it's not possible, the alternative is authoritarianism. The alternative is fascism. And Jerry, who is on the call, also involved with the SNCC Legacy Project, is deeply involved in places like Salvador Bahia, which has more Black people than any other city outside of the continent of Africa, and yet has not, up until this day, had a Black mayor in a city that is over 70% Black. And we see institutionalized racism at every level of the economy in Salvador Bahia. So those ties between African Americans who are building and constructing a true multiracial democracy in this landmass are beginning to find common ties, not for the first time, to Mr. Charlie Cobb's point earlier, that this is not new, seeing those linkages across these borders. But we're beginning to see those linkages take shape in an epic battle for multiracial democracy and against any force that would try to undermine its expression.
Now, you brought up some really, really critical and important points here, and that as we think then about sharing this conversation with people who are interested in organizing and the future of organizing, what are then some of the lessons that we then would say we would want to share with them? And also, how do you for what you just spoke about, the on the multicultural and the difference of building coalitions of people and organizing coalitions of people, uh, both on a global level and in national circumstances, or even in more localized settings like Bahia. What then, as an experienced organizer, would be your advice? What are some of the tenets that you think that organizers should focus on for then changing this picture for the future?
Um, if you don't mind, I'd like to really
Please.
focus in my response on the United States as opposed to the whole world, which, you know, I recognize the kinds of things Austin was talking about, but I want to focus on the US. And firstly, the first great lesson, certainly from SNCC's experience, and I think throughout the whole history of certainly Black community organizing in the United States, is that it is possible to dig in, gain a foothold, and organize struggle to effect meaningful change. Doesn't mean that every issue is going to be resolved, every problem is going to be solved, but it is possible under circumstances that you wouldn't have imagined to dig into these communities, gain a foothold, make your way to people who would provide leadership in those communities and organize struggle that leads to meaningful change. And SNCC's experience is one example of this. It's not the only example, but it's one example of this. And I cite it simply because that's my generation, you know, and I can speak to that. But I'm aware that this has always been true, else we wouldn't exist at all in this country. So that's the first thing to learn. And it's a challenge to today's activists. How do you do that in Chicago or Los Angeles or Milwaukee or Baltimore or all these places? I can't talk meaningfully about that because my experience is in the rural Black Belt South. I can tell you anything you want to know about Sunflower County or Tallahatchie County or Issaquah County, but that's my experience. But it confronts this generation of activists. How do you do that in these places? And it's, as I said earlier, I think that's a more complicated proposition than it was for us. I may be wrong on that, but I think that's so. Secondly, and I want to stress it, it is possible to win victories. You know, I don't think it's easy, certainly for me living in Florida, to get depressed, looking around me at the political landscape and who runs it and how they run it. And so it's easy to get depressed. And by that, I mean have sustained depression. But it's important to recognize that it is possible to win victories, to be successful in what you set out to do. Not that you're going to be successful in everything you set out to do, but it is possible to do this. And I don't think I'm you know, proposing some overly romantic notion of heroic martyrs and warriors out there in the field, but it is possible, and I think that's important. That's one of the lessons, certainly, that can be found in the Southern freedom movement of the 1960s that we were a part of as SNCC field secretaries. Thirdly and lastly, because it's one of the things I notice looking at today's movement, for lack of a better word, the movement of today's activists and how their composition. The movement today is much more integrated than I remember the movement from our time. And maybe that's from living in Florida, where when I look at activists in Florida, I see a lot of Hispanic activists. I see white activists. I see it in a way that seems different, even factoring in the Mississippi Summer Project of 1964. But looking at today's movement, I see, and that in some ways is a kind of victory. I think these right-wing people are going to lose. I happen to think that, and they will shoot their own selves in the foot. And Donald Trump is a good example of that. But I see a movement that's much more multiracial. And that does not mean that the concerns of Black people are somehow minimized in this more expanded movement. It's simply to note that at least insofar, and I hardly ever leave Florida. So when I look around Florida, what I see is not only more young activism, but I see a movement that's much more multiracial, and it's not contradictory with Black struggle. I mean, I still see myself as primarily concerned about Black struggle, even though I recognize that there is, in fact, a larger multiracial struggle underway too. And both abortion and education come immediately to mind as issues that transcend race, even though I could talk about those movements, those situations specifically in terms of race, the effect on Black women, for instance, or the effect on Black families, for instance, what DeSantis is trying to do with education. But so I'm focused on Black struggle, but I can't help but be aware of the fact that there's also, and it's different than the 1960s, I think, SDS and those organizations notwithstanding, it's different than the 1960s. I see a discussion and struggle underway about what the country itself is to be. As you know, as you said, you know, is it does this country really want to have a democracy? It's one big issue, and it's not at all clear, but it's out there because there are powerful people out here working hard and aggressively to undermine it. And here I'm in the heartland of where that is unfolding. Ironically, I think, and again I'll conclude with this. To my way of thinking, it makes the South much more important to what the country is going to be. I think wherever the answers lie, they're going to be found in the final analysis in the South and what unfolds in the South. I'm done.
For now, you seem to be nodding in agreement. So let's hear your thoughts, Austin.
Man, so I think, you know, whenever Charlie and I are together with the all the other young people who, well, we're not so young anymore, but millennials who are in this collection called the Freedom Side, we have these discussions over dinner and side conversation, and we just go on and on and on, and it's beautiful. So it's like, I love these. You know, the fact that I get to do this for free with Mr. Charlie Cobb is just insane. But I would say, you know, there's a couple of things I'll try and say quickly. One lesson is the importance of leadership, that individual leaders can make a significant difference in the outcome of events in historic time. And I think when I was younger, for good reasons, I underplayed the significance of individual leaders in shaping world history and events, and that was a fundamental mistake. We need competent leaders. We need leaders who are effective and who can make things happen. We need leaders who are virtuous, and we need leaders who can build up other leaders. And it really matters to have leaders. I know Miss Ella Baker said strong people don't need strong leaders. And I agree in some sense, but someone's always going to step into leadership, whether you like it or not. And I personally deferred too often to incompetent, non-virtuous leaders who couldn't make things happen. And luckily, I'm young enough to correct that mistake. I'll never make that mistake again. A friend of mine named Charles Taylor, when we were coming up to working together with Mr. Charlie Cobb and some of the SNCC veterans in this project I alluded to earlier, the Freedom Side, you know, he was a young protege of Derrick Johnson, the president of the Mississippi NAACP. Today, Charles Taylor is the president of the NAACP. You know, I mentioned Karen Bass, who was a longtime community organizer. She's now the mayor of Los Angeles. Brandon Johnson, a union organizer, a teacher in Chicago, is now the mayor of Chicago. And so I just want to really encourage people to see the key role that leaders can play in shaping the course of history, not on their own. And I want to make it clear that leaders should be the most skilled people in our movement. They should be steward leaders who are respected and accountable to a base. And that leadership is not about proximity to media or to funders, or just because you have a show on television, therefore you're a leader. That's not what I'm talking about. There are skilled people of every race and gender. And there are also unskilled people of every race and gender. And so what it takes to be a leader really requires thought. But I want to just stress the importance of leaders in shaping the outcomes over historic time, and to step into that leadership if you can meet some of those criteria. The second thing is, when we organize from the emerging future backward. Don't just organize from the past looking forward. And why is this important? Because we can't predict, you know, after the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was not seated at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, one of the things that Miss Mary King, who was a SNCC veteran who participated in that time period, said to me is that they didn't have a plan B. That if Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party did not succeed in New Jersey at the Democratic National Convention, what would we do next? What's the scenario planning? And the lack of an effective plan after that, now Mr. Charlie Cobb lived it, so maybe you have a different interpretation. People went in many different directions, some for the better, and sometimes maybe not for the better. And so the reason I say that, give that story is we should be scenario planning about what the future looks like 10, 20 years from now, and saying, how do we get to a future in artificial intelligence, in clean energy, in broadband and information communication technology, in biological technology that benefits our communities. And there are many examples in the current present context of federal dollars that are coming into the Black Belt South that can help us shape the future of these industries if we have the foresight. And then and a part of that I want to say is, Mr. Charlie said, let's win big victories. You can win big victories. I want to make a commitment to everybody listening and ask people to join me. Let's end child poverty in our generation. Let's get it done. Let's talk 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now about we were the generation that ended child poverty in a nation of so much abundance with all the technological means to make it happen. Let's get it done. And I agree with Mr. Charlie Cobb. We can win big victories and we can end child poverty. And then my last lesson learned is think globally, act locally. You cannot understand the emergence of this authoritarianism in the United States, what some people are referring to based on hard evidence and data as white Christian nationalism, which is a dismissal of constitutional democracy around a set of policies, practices, beliefs that want to impose a theocratic system of governance on the people of the United States. And there's a great Brookings report if you want to dig into how more than half of one of the political parties in the United States adheres to this nationalistic, anti-constitutional vision of the future. You can't understand that phenomena without understanding the changing relationship of the United States on the global scene. That after the defeats in Afghanistan and Iraq, after the defeat in Vietnam, after the loss of prestige that some Americans have had, or their perceptions of prestige in the global arena in relationship to countries in the global South, they are filling that loss of prestige and living standards, which have declined in the United States in the absence of the dominance that the US once had, with these percolations of authoritarian populism. So to not think globally is not to understand the root causes of why these forces of opposition to multiracial democracy in the United States are emerging. And getting this right is life or death. A governor in Texas has decided to pardon a white man who took an AK-47 and murdered a Black Lives Matter activist. We're getting to the point in the nation where overt calls for race war and white nationalism are mainstream in one of the main political parties, and it's happening locally in communities, but as part of a global context. And so the analysis there matters. And I agree with Mr. Charlie Cobb that strategically the South of the United States is a key region to organize in and see opportunities to move forward for a democracy that's inclusive of all people, including working class white people, Latinos, Black people, Indigenous. We are building an inclusive future. I would say that that's also true of the global South, that there is an emergent movement in the world of hope for the light of democracy, of an inclusive vision of participation for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, or class status, or gender. And that movement is taking form in the global South. And so those South connections between the United States, places like Jackson, Mississippi, and Salvador Bahia, I think are going to be areas of creative strategy and organizing as we build from an emerging future that's coming toward us quicker than we think.
And as we near the end of our conversation, I would ask, how do we keep the conversation going, particularly with a younger generation that is emerging as well? And that we've sort of jokingly said we don't even yet know what to call that younger generation, but we know they are there, and that how do we then continue this kind of conversation between generations of activists and organizers, and then with a younger generation. So I'd appreciate any enlightenment that you can share about that.
Well, I think we have more tools today than we had in the past for continuing this kind of conversation, both more tools in this arena that I'm unfamiliar with, in terms of social media and all the internet kind of stuff. I mean, we can have conversations with far greater ease now with any group or subgroup that we want. And two, I mean, I think the kinds of things we did just last month in Tennessee with the Freedom Side people, 30 some odd young people, just to really facilitate a conversation and get out of the way of their conversation, to listen to them go back and forth about what the movement was about. There's any number of possibilities like this. Again, I find that among young people, particularly young activists, with respect to old people like me, there's a lot of interest in the struggles that preceded their struggle, and they're open to almost anything we might suggest by way of facilitating conversations with it. I just think that it's far easier today than I remember it being in the 1960s to have conversations and dialogue with a surprisingly wide range of people. I'm thinking of this because my cousin in Baltimore had me speak to her flower club. And these were pretty much your little old ladies, with their hats and stuff. And we were able to do it by Zoom. So I mean, if I can talk to a church flower club in Baltimore in 2021, 2023, I'm sorry, anything is possible with respect to conversation. And they wanted to hear about the movement.
Couldn't agree more. The tools are here. And, I just thank God. I am a person of faith, and I believe deeply that, I've been blessed to know SNCC, and to have you invite me to this opportunity. It means the world to me. I don't take it for granted. So I really appreciate you, Mr. Charlie Cobb. You know that, but and you as well, Jennifer, and all the some other people on the screen that others might not be able to see. So I want to say that I have been a beneficiary of utilizing some of these tools that Mr. Charlie Cobb referred to, and getting that intergenerational exchange. I think that right now, immigrant youth are hurting around what's called DACA in the United States. It was a temporary protection passed through administrative order for undocumented immigrants. They came to the country as kids, and so they aren't technically citizens, but they grew up here. Due to this authoritarian nationalism that we've been talking about, anti-constitutional populist authoritarianism, the Supreme Court is putting that protection for immigrant youth under the gun right now. And that means that many of the young people that we have worked with and come to know have no protection. And Generation Z, as they're called now, who were too young to benefit from that temporary protection, who are immigrant youth. And we know that Latinos, that population, and Asian immigrants, Black immigrants as well from Caribbean, Africa, they're coming of age, and they also are lacking protected status, Haitian immigrants. So I think one of the best mediums for intergenerational exchange about the SNCC legacy is with immigrant youth in the height of their struggles, because many of the questions that they're grappling with at the level that we talked about earlier, of strategy, of tactical innovation, of operational questions, where do we get a foothold, and why do we get a foothold there? Those questions are real there. And I think another example I would point to of where we can begin that work is in the LGBTQ youth movement. I myself am not an LGBTQ person, but when I see the bullying that's going on to that community, particularly of young people who are doing nothing other than loving and expressing themselves, mainly culturally, and they've been used as scapegoats for right-wing anti-democratic forces who don't have a vision to improve people's lives when it comes to clean drinking water or broadband access. So they're scapegoating a community of young people who are just different than they are, because they don't have an agenda to improve people's lives. And I think that that movement of LGBTQ young people has the potential to be powerful, a powerful political force, if they register to vote, if they take seriously some of the lessons that Mr. Charlie Cobb shared here about local communities empowering and finding voice. So I guess what I'm getting at is there are key struggles in Generation Z today, including in the movement for Black Lives around the Cobb City in Atlanta. They're building this massive policing facility in Atlanta, right outside of where I grew up, where we have massive homelessness and an education budget deficits. And you say, what are we doing with this? So I think Generation Z, where they are in motion around the struggles that impact their lives and are asking the kinds of questions that SNCC asked, convening them in the course of struggle could be a key intervention in this point in time. And I'm willing to, I think people know I'm a fundraiser, you know, and have some access to resources. Could we think about a series of convenings with SNCC that's not just about what did the millennial generation do, but around some thematic areas with key Gen Z activists who are facing this right-wing, authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-constitutional movement, and play the role that Miss Ella Baker played for SNCC at Shaw University in our current time period.
Wonderful, wonderful. Charlie, any additional comments?
The only thing I don't have anything to add to anything that say with respect to what Austin said. I just want to put out here, I know we talk a lot about intergenerational conversations, whether it's millennials or Gen Z or whatever, but I also want to put out there the necessity to expanding the conversation that takes place among our own generation. I mean, there are a lot of people out here that are as old as I am, and SNCC people that aren't in this conversation. Ann and I were talking about this. My wife Ann and I were talking about this because we have a mayoral election next month here in Jacksonville, and we went to cast early ballots, and we went in about 2:30 in the afternoon, and just as a part of conversation, casual conversation with the people manning the voting arena, asked how many people have been in to vote so far, and the lady said 7, and it was 2:30 in the afternoon. So there seems to me to be the necessity for a conversation, and I've started it with the minister who has a church next door to us. What are you all doing? You guys doing about this vote, getting people out? What kind of conversation do you have in your church? Because I don't attend it. And there seems to me to be as distinct conversations with intergenerational, a conversation that needs to be had with the baby boomers and the like, you know, about how do they want to engage this process of change. I'm not sure about how to do that because I don't see being able to gather them at, say, Highlander or Tulu or someplace like that. But there is a necessity for that kind of conversation. I don't see it as being a conversation among intellectual baby boomers and the like. But how do you have that conversation, or is it possible to have that kind of conversation with that age group? You know, the people in their 60s and 70s and yes, 80s. about what's happening in the society and what needs to be done. Because there's a lot of experience in that age group with what society has done. But very little information flows, at least in my way, in my direction, about what they're thinking with respect about change. What is on their minds about it? And I sort of would like to see that conversation unfold as well. And we need to give some thought about how we might organize that. And I don't think it has to be large. I'm not talking about a conference. ASALA, the association, is having its annual conference here in Jacksonville in September, and they'll have a couple of thousand people here. I'm not talking about something on that scale. I'm talking about something a little smaller.
Well, I think there are multiple layers of it, and many conversations, small conversations that should be held, and some of them can take place like this on Zoom or FaceTime or as virtual calls. But I do believe that we are in a time period right now at this very moment as we approach 2024 and beyond, when these questions that the two of you have already addressed so eloquently will be right upon us and in near crisis mode. So I do think it's critical for us to start the conversation. I'm glad that we are having this conversation, but I do think that, as you, Charlie, and Austin have pointed out, it's important to extend this conversation as well.
I agree.
So I say let's take you up on it.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give it some thought. Come back to you.
and 7 people voting, Mr. Charlie Cobb, is not good.
No,
And
that was at 2:30 in the afternoon, so presumably more people came, but
Yeah,
still,
but still.
2:30 in the afternoon to have 7 people,
That's pretty
the
late.
number of people showing up at the polling place is just, really outrageous, and it speaks to a failure of leadership in part.
And I would say, unfortunately, nationally, we have seen some declines in Black voting, even in the last midterm election. And we've got a big opportunity in Mississippi for Black voters to put their footprint in the arc of history in Mississippi. But let's convene, because I love what Jennifer, there's so many practical opportunities where we can act right now and make a difference, and it's clearly needed. So Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your time today.
Okay. It's always good to see y'all.
Great to see you.